All right. High five. Thank you, everybody.
Hello, everybody. How are we all doing today? A little bit louder, a little bit louder. So before I start, I just want to say, 10 years is a huge milestone. Conferences are extremely, extremely stressful to organize. So can we all just give a round of applause to the organizers for achieving the 10-year anniversary of Craft Conference? It's a big deal. And I'm super, super, super happy to be here today to talk to you guys about improving your software architecture with murder. And so, okay, we're gonna at some point be able to advance the slides. All of our technology has gone wrong.
Let's try now.
Ah, okay, excellent. All right, so as already alluded to, my name is Marianne Bellotti. I'm best known for writing this book called Kill It With Fire about modernizing legacy systems. I am now here to talk to you about murder. I am confirming every stereotype Europeans have about Americans in a single 5-minute introduction. I have about 20 plus years of software experience. I never know whether to count the years I spent as a 13-year-old kid on the internet or not. So depending on how you count, it's 20, it's 30, it's somewhere in that range, right? And if you want to follow the types of things that I work on and the stuff that I like to blog about, you can find me at this website, Bellotti Tech. So let's start with this. I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, murder? What are we talking about here? What does she mean we're going to improve our software architecture with murder? What's that about? Is that like this? Are we just going to get rage obsessed at work and slaughter our colleagues who use patterns we disagree with? By the way, this is me. I'm on team tabs. I really just like having to figure out whether or not my indentations are perfectly aligned by one space. So if that really annoys you, it's my fault. I'm definitely a tabs person. So no, this isn't, thank you, team tabs, excellent. Glad to be representing. This isn't what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about raging out on your colleagues. Primarily, I'm talking about fear and how we manage fear on engineering teams. Because building and deploying technology is inherently very risky, even when the technology itself seems not super risky. There's a lot of fear that goes into building and maintaining technology, and it affects engineering teams. And I used to joke that most of my job was making sure that the right people panicked about the right things at the right time in the right amounts. So much of the work that I did running engineering teams and doing incident response and being kind of the expert on call for things was managing that fear. Fear inherently changes the types of decisions that people make, but not in the way you assume, not in a predictable way. You would assume that when people are afraid, they make less risky decisions. They gravitate towards things that are safe. But a lot of times what we see, especially in really high-risk situations, is that they sometimes gravitate towards decisions that have a high possibility of failure, but that other people have failed at already. The predictable, the reliable failure. They want to fail the same way everybody else has. There's a very famous expression that's a tiny bit out of date these days, that nobody ever gets fired for buying IBM. But at the time when that was a common thing people said, IBM was like the prestige compute brand, right? So if you went out and you bought a bunch of IBM and your project was a disaster, well, no one was going to fire you for that because you bought the best possible thing, right? So you'll see a lot of times people fail in a way that they know people have failed before, a way that is very, very risky, but other people have failed before, so they feel safe. And that's the difference between local and global incentives and optimizations. When people choose a path that's deliberately higher risk than other options, it's because they're optimizing locally. They're optimizing to save their job and spare themselves the embarrassment at the expense of the project, the mission, the company, so on and so forth. And so we're not talking about this. We're not talking about like murdering our colleagues for making mistakes or bringing the Incredible Hulk to work. Really talking about this, a concept known as a murder board, which is essentially a panel of experts that are vetting plans before they go out into deploy into production. And so a murder board is a technique that was developed at NASA, the space agency, and it's for high-risk, high-stress scenarios. It's somewhat similar to a pre-mortem, if you've ever done a pre-mortem before, where you sit down and you sort of think to yourself, well, what could go wrong? And how would that thing that went wrong play out along of our architecture? How would that look? And it's very, very common these days, but not in technology anymore. There isn't really a concept that most people in engineering teams use. It's very, very common in policy and oversight, and this is, in fact, where I first encountered it as a structure. But back in the late 60s, early 70s, at the Ames Research Center, there was a particular leader of the Ames Research Center, Hans Mark, who created this concept of murder board. And the reason why he did this is because what the research center did was very high risk, very expensive, and sometimes difficult to persuade people that it was actually worth the investment. But he wanted people to be ambitious. He wanted them to be confident. And he understood that the real threat to them wasn't at the research center. The real threat to them was in HQ, pitching these projects, asking for millions, possibly billions of dollars to do research on rockets and different aspects of the space program for NASA. Mark was kind of like an antagonistic, argumentative person in the first place, and he thought that that was good for the cultural mix at the research center, because for better or worse, while this research is incredibly important, it is very expensive, and there's always political pressures to sort of downsize it and cut the costs, and like, why do we need it? Shouldn't we put this money in other places? So on and so forth. But he wanted people to sort of be ambitious and confident and aggressive and stake out really like unattainable positions as long as they could defend it. He wanted them to be prepared to defend it. Like I said, I first encountered this technique when I was working more on the policy side. And it was a thing we would do whenever like a boss or a senior executive leader was called to testify in front of Congress, which is a really high stress situation. By the way, if you're ever in DC, go and check the hearing schedules for Congress. Almost all of them are open to the public. You can come in, sit down, and watch a congressional hearing. It changes your perspective on things quite a lot, because what you see happen all the time is like a representative will like get to the microphone and they'll make this passionate speech, and then they'll tack a question on the end of it, and then as soon as the question mark is finished and the camera has toggled away from them, they will immediately get up and leave the room, right? And you'll just watch people toggle in and toggle out to like yell questions and then walk off before they heard the answer. So it's a high-stress situation, and it's in a lot of ways, it feels like a very no-win situation for people that have to go through it. And what we would do to prep our leaders is we would do a murder board. We'd bring our smartest people, our most knowledgeable and experienced people to the table, and we would try to think of every ridiculous gotcha question, every criticism, every flaw in the program that we could think of, and we'd throw those questions at them as like a practice round. And what was important to understand about this process is that we were doing this out of love, right? We were doing this because like they're on our team and we want to protect them. Like we're not like throwing these awful questions at them in order to humiliate them or embarrass them or to make them feel like they're going to be in trouble. We were doing it because it was understood that if they could get through our questions, they'd be in a better position when they were standing up in front of Congress, in front of the world potentially. And so what these two situations have in common, trying to launch rockets into space and trying to testify in front of Congress, is that they're high-fear scenarios. They're scenarios in which people have a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety about going through them. And we don't make good decisions when we're really scared. We make good decisions when we're in periods of psychological safety, right? So a murder board is a technique for helping to mitigate a lot of that fear and anxiety and stress that comes from these very unique situations. And for that reason, I kind of describe it as like advanced engineering management black ops, right? This is not a situation you want to apply to everything. And I would say it's actually a rare situation. It's not an alternative to doing code review, right? It's not a compliance or oversight activity, and it's not a replacement for postmortems. This sort of technique has its use, but it shouldn't be a regular part of the routine of an engineering team, because you shouldn't have situations that are that extreme in their stress level. And the point of a murder board is not that we're going to perfect our approaches through criticism. That's not what we're doing when we murder board something. The point of a murder board is to prepare our people to do something scary that they have to do anyway. So we can't change the fact that they have to do the scary thing. We have to get through it, and we're going to help them get through it. That's the point of the murder board. And so your ideal scenario for a murder board looks something like this. Maybe when we're planning, we're in a kind of a low stress period because we're planning, right? Everything's hypothetical. Everything's on the table. Then we start vetting and iterating on that plan, and things start to get a little more stressful and a little bit scarier because we're making decisions now, and like those decisions will have consequences. Then we execute on the plan, and this is the highest stress moment, right? This is where things can go critically wrong. This is the scariest part of things. You have a scenario that looks like this. This is a great place to use a murder board, because what the murder board does is it takes the pressure off. It allows us to kind of go through some of that fear, confront it, and then we go into executing the plan. It's still high stress, it's still scary, but hopefully it's a manageable amount of fear because we feel protected, we feel confident, we feel like we've done everything possible to face these problems before we got to execute. However, if you have a situation that looks like this, which I hope is what a deploy, for example, looks like wherever you work, right? That it's not a fear situation. Like, you have this normal low-stress planning, and then you vet and iterate, and that's fine. And sure, execution might be a tiny bit stressful because things could always go wrong, and no one likes breaking the build, right? That's a little bit stressful. If you have a situation that looks like this, don't use a murder board, right? Because if you apply a murder board to a situation where you don't have that critical fear at the end of the process, you get something that looks like this, where you have the low stress period, then you go into the murder board, it becomes this toxic, really like cripples people's confidence, and then they go into executing like devastated. They feel like their plans have been ripped apart, they're questioning everything that they know, and you've actually created a really toxic workplace environment. So this is not what you use a murder board for. Murder boards work best when they come from a place of care and compassion. The reason why this format works is because there is this horrifically awful monster at the end of the story. And so the people that we're putting through the murder board understand that as colleagues, we're there for them. And we're doing this to protect them. We're doing this to try to help them get through that scary thing. We want to protect them from threat. You have to sort of work very hard to pick your battles here and like make sure that it maintains that vibe. Okay, so that's what a murder board is. How do you run one? How does one work? Well, the first thing we do, we have to check to make sure we have a big, scary event in the future. So check, we've done that. Then we need to figure out, pull together our best and brightest to be on the murder board itself. Then we do some doc collection, we do some review, we prepare the murder board, we prepare the people going through the murder board. Then we do the murdering, which is the best part. And then after the murdering, we finalize the plan. There might be some things that the murder board brought up that are actually legitimate points. We go back, we want to review it, tighten it up, what have you. Picking your murderers. Who should be on a murder board? Well, that really depends on what the source of fear actually is at the end of this process, right? So there are three main types of failure we're going to talk about when we're thinking about murder boards. We got technical failure, we got social capital failure, and we got social contract failure. Technical failure is what it sounds like. It's a scenario where our technology fails, and generally our technology fails in like a cascading fashion where we actually don't know what the side effects or consequences are going to be, the unpredictable technical failure. We go back to this idea of like no one gets fired for buying IBM. The murder board helps inspire confidence because we're bringing our best and brightest technologists to the table. And if none of them can figure out a better way to do what you're trying to do, then you're safe, right? You have that implicit like feeling of protection because you went through the murder board process and like, however the failure happened, it didn't come up in the murder board. So like the best and brightest couldn't do any better than you're safe, right? And so if we're looking at that kind of situation, then the people we want on the board are principal engineers, staff engineers, architects, people who have that kind of implicit authority and legitimacy in our technical org. The people will think, well, this guy vetted it, so we did the best that we could. Social capital failure is a little bit different. Social capital failure is essentially embarrassment. Did we expose the organization or ourselves to derision and mockery? This can be external, but it can also be internal. Like, did I, as the CEO, have some sort of embarrassing failure in front of the entire company because this thing went wrong? But when we think about doing a murder board in this case, we have to actually think really critically about what does failure mean in this scenario. Is it like somebody's gonna die, or is it just we're all gonna get fired? Like, we really have to be very honest about what the source of fear is. But if we have a social capital failure that's really the big scary thing at the end of this process, then the board members we want to draw on are really more like business leaders, people from strategy, people from legal, people from marketing. It's a different group of people we want to pull to the table to this murder board if that's the thing that we're afraid of at the end of it. And then lastly, we have social capital failure. And social contract failure is injury or harm to customers or the general public, right? Have we shipped something into the world that is actively causing harm in the world? And are there any impacts beyond the immediate danger? So a great example of this is like a security vulnerability, right? You have the initial vulnerability, the initial impacts, but then also you have secondary impacts. Did an attacker get in and steal everybody's private data? What are we gonna do about that? Those kind of scenarios. And so a board where you're worried about social contract failure is really composed of those type of people, security professionals, compliance, legal. Those are the people that are gonna command the most respect on a murder board where that's the source of fear at the end of it. So let's go back to this idea of launching a rocket. Is launching a rocket into space primarily the fear a technical failure, a contract, or what? So the technical failure here is it's a complex system. Rockets are very complicated, and they have high degrees of potential technical failure because they're very complicated machines, right? So we could definitely have some sort of technical disaster that fails in an unpredictable way. Is there a social capital failure here? Yeah, it's embarrassing when a rocket explodes on launch pad. I mean, I guess we could call Elon Musk and see what he thinks about that, like how embarrassing that is for it to be a public failure. But the general public also understands that doing something like launching a rocket into space is a hard problem with a high possibility of failure. And so, because it's seen as like remarkable and innovative to do it in the first place, when it fails, it's not really the loss of social capital that's the thing we're the most scared of when we're launching a rocket into space. Similarly with social contract, there are life and death impacts to something like launching a rocket into space going wrong. There definitely are. There are people on the rocket primarily, right? But generally speaking, the people who are in the line of fire know what they're getting into. Like, they know the risks of being involved in this rocket launch. It's possible that there's collateral damage in the general public, but these situations are relatively rare. So when we're doing something like launching a rocket into space, the number one source of that big scariness is actually the technical failure. It's not the capital, and it's not the contract. Going back to this testifying in front of Congress, like, what does the failure look like here? What are we scared of? Well, there really isn't usually a technical component to testifying in front of Congress, at least not one that has anything to do with us. There's definitely a social capital component to testifying in front of Congress. These are sound bites that go around the world, repeated forever, put on YouTube, auto-tuned to like videos, made into rap music. I mean, so there's a high public visibility, and those clips can spread if you say something really ridiculous or embarrassing. And there are potentially social contract failures, but they're also relatively rare. Mainly the thing we're worried about when you're testifying in Congress is that you're gonna look like a schmuck in front of the world. That's mainly what we're worried about. So when we do a murder board, that's what we're focusing on, that's the composition. Okay, so one of the benefits of murder boards is that despite the fact that it is aggressive and antagonistic, it can actually leave people feeling like their colleagues have their back and inspire a lot of confidence, because we're having our decisions and our perspectives validated by people that we respect, that we see as like experts in this particular area. And actually, when things do go wrong, that can help reinforce a blameless culture. Because when we come back and we do the post-mortem, we kind of like go, well, it's obviously nothing that you could have done to stop this failure, because we vetted this plan backwards and forwards and nobody else picked up on this problem either. So now we have our murderers. How do we prepare them to do the murdering? Well, I think for best results, both sides need to be pretty thoroughly briefed and knowledgeable about what the plan actually is, if there's any historical context behind the plan, what the risks are. So on policy, we ask ourselves, like, who's on the committee we're testifying in front of? What are their feelings about this topic area? What kind of questions they normally ask? Everybody knows who's the jerk on this committee that like asks the like completely ridiculous straw man question and then walks out of the conference room. So making sure that the person who's going to be doing the testifying knows this, knows who their allies are on that committee, who their potential aggressors are on that committee, and what the kind of like buzzwords and like hot topics are. On the technology side, we talk about what are we attempting to do? Has this failed in the past? If it has failed in the past, how did it fail in the past? Who are the people implementing the plan, and like what are their skill sets? These are the sort of things we want to be familiar with. And this is also a really great excuse to do an audit of your basic documentation. Like, do we have any run books for doing the thing we're about to do, or for the system itself? Do we have architectural decision records around this part of the system? What are our governance standards? Like, making sure that all of that is spelled out and clear and that people know about it. So this part should go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway because it feels like malpractice not to. This is about being supportive towards our towards our colleagues. So we're murdering the plan, not the people, right? We're attacking the plan. So we want to make sure that we stay away from personal attacks and like focus on criticisms of the plan itself. And we also want to remember that it's an attack and defend format, right? So we want to stay away from straw man arguments. We want to stay away from appealing to anonymous authorities. We want to phrase things as like what ifs rather than this will, because the only way I can argue against a this will is by saying, no, you're wrong, and then that's just kind of a pointless conversation. We can go back and forth about that. But I like to give my murder boards a day or two to kind of formulate some basic questions to submit to the people that are going to be part of defending the plan, right? Because the best murder boards result in in-depth discussions about our concerns and how serious they are. And if we give the defenders a hint of where the murder board is thinking, like how they're gravitating, what issues they're gravitating towards, they will come in better prepared to defend themselves. So I like to ask my murder board to prepare a small set of like questions of topics they're sort of thinking about, so that the people going through the murder board feel as prepared as possible to defend what they're trying to do. Okay, so let's talk about a time that I actually did this. Like, what was this situation? Why did I choose this as my technique? And how did it end up? I'm gonna try to protect the names of the innocent, but if you know my career history, you can probably guess which company this is. So don't shout it out, that's all I'll say. The scenario here is that we had a particular feature that allowed people to execute untrusted code on our infrastructure. This allowed the customer to add custom business logic, which was great. But it would also, quite conveniently, take down the entire product when there was a failure on our side. So not so much when there was a failure on their side, but when we had an upgrade or something that went wrong, the whole product would go down. The additional problem that we had here is that the team that was trying to maintain this particular feature, which was probably about 5 or 6 years old at this point, was not the original team. All the original team had left the company. Now, fortunately, they had left the company on good terms. There wasn't any bad blood there. They'd actually left the company to go do a startup spun off of this idea. So they were both on good terms with the founders and also still in the mix in terms of like how this technology works and how to do it well. But we only really had one engineer on the team that existed at that time maintaining this technology that had any previous experience with that feature. Essentially, a person who was a junior engineer at the time of the original team was still in the company and was now the team lead for this particular feature. Everybody else was new. And like I said, it was about 5 or 6 years old, so it was a nice little piece of legacy code on our infrastructure. It was basically AWS Lambda before AWS Lambda existed. And if you do any work with legacy code and modernization efforts, you hear that story a lot. You find something strange in the infrastructure, and you go, what's that? And they go, well, if we had to build that today, we would use this thing. But we didn't have that thing at the time, so we just built it ourselves, and then we never removed it. And so the problem that we had with this piece of infrastructure is that we had a lot of out-of-date and end-of-life runtimes that people were executing their custom code on. And previously, when we had tried to resolve this problem of upgrading these end-of-life runtimes, this was sort of how that upgrade went. Like, everything broke. There was chaos and panic. We had to roll back the upgrade almost immediately, and we had a hard time figuring out why things had failed in the first place. And so the fear that we had primarily came down to how on earth do we test these upgrades before we do them? Because we were dealing with runtimes that weren't just out of date, but where the upgrade actually involved a lot of breaking changes, right? So there were a couple of breaking changes between Node 10 and Node 11, and then there were a couple more breaking changes between Node 11 and Node 12. So if a customer had written code for Node 10 and we were upgrading them and the runtime, then their code could potentially break in ways that we couldn't predict. And we didn't own the code that they had written. We had too many customers to go through and check every single person's code individually. And even if we could check every single customer's custom code individually, often the reason why they put that custom code in the first place was because they wanted to interact with a third-party API or an internal system in flow with our flow, right? So we didn't necessarily have access to third-party APIs. We didn't necessarily have access to the internal systems. So we maybe couldn't test this code. And like, we're dealing with a situation where breaking the product was super bad. This was an IAM solution, so it's a gatekeeper by design. So when I said when it breaks, everything breaks, yeah, that was by design. It's identity. You want everything to break when it breaks, right? We didn't have the advantage that AWS has in these sort of scenarios because we didn't expose the runtime to the customer. The runtime itself was not configurable by the customer. So if you've ever been through this an end-of-life runtime with AWS Lambda, you will know that Amazon calls you up and says, hey, you're using an end-of-life Lambda. You should really upgrade your runtime. You have until X day to do it. If you don't do it by X day, we will do it for you. And if it breaks, well, that's on you, because we gave you lots of warning to upgrade your runtime. We couldn't do that because we had never exposed that interface to the customer. So we were kind of like, we had painted ourselves into a corner. Obviously, we should modify the feature so that we didn't have this scenario anymore, but we couldn't modify this feature. We couldn't make any upgrades to it. So here we go. What is the big fear at the end of this upgrade? The technical. It's hard to predict what would fail or the extent of the impact of that failure. The capital. All services have outages occasionally. So The customer will probably forgive us. It's probably not super embarrassing that we have an outage as long as it's short. And the fact that we're defaulting to closed in this situation helps. We're defaulting to secure. It's annoying that your service is down, but it's better than everybody just being able to come on in and do what they like. And then the contract, it is possible that because the IAM system went down and you can't log into your service, that there's some life or death consequence to that. But it's mitigated by having a really great MTTR. So if we're able to respond to these outages and rollback changes really, really fast, then that shouldn't be a huge problem. So really, what we're looking at is technical fear. We do not know how this is going to fail or the extent of the impact. So putting together a murder board, who's on the board? So I pulled a principal engineer who was an original hire of the company, still there today, actually. And then I pulled another one of our principal engineers who was a former Google SRE and therefore walked on goddamn water. It was amazing. People were like, oh, well, he said this, so it must be true. Any of you have a former Googler in your engineering team, you know what I'm talking about. And then I pulled a staff SRE that was probably one of our most respected SREs. And then the last person I pulled was our head of testing. So this is really the best of brightest of this particular engineering org. They're well respected. Everybody knows them. Everybody trusts their opinion. And we asked the team to prepare a plan specifically to update these out-of-date runtimes. The actual murder had a structure of a pre-mortem. What could go wrong? How would we know? What's the resolution to that problem? So what happened? Well, as it turned out, we went through this murder board. The murder board was not able to take down the plan or find significant flaws in it. The team came in really well prepared. They took it really seriously. And they did the upgrade, and it went fine, which I think was probably the most shocking thing that this organization had ever experienced. It was like an uncontroversial upgrade because they went in prepared. But they also built up that confidence. This team was like a group of scared rabbits on the side of the cage. They were so scared of making any changes to this feature set that they had inherited, that they didn't feel like they knew very well. And we showed them that they actually knew it really well, and they were actually really well prepared and qualified to do what we were asking them to do. So it built up their confidence, but then it also built up the confidence in the team with the leadership. Because when you lose an entire team of engineers and you have to replace all of them with people that are pretty new, that's really scary. But like, there are many leaders that are like, yeah, these are the right guys for the job. And so we showed them that they had hired the right people, that we had staffed that team appropriately, that they could do the job. And the best thing is that they then began to ship more improvements. And we began to take this piece of legacy code and slowly and incrementally move it to a better and better and better state where we weren't backed into this corner. And then deploys were lower and lower risk. So, winding things down. Once again, murder boards are for very, very specific situations. They are for high stress, high fear events. Events that are necessary, unavoidable, but scare the crap out of people. They can be an opportunity to vet plans. They are a great opportunity to prepare and vet plans, but it's not a code review. Please don't use this as a replacement for a code review. That will go very, very badly long term. And it should not be part of your regular development life cycles because I mean, like, if terrifying fear is a part of your regular developer life cycle, there's probably more work we have to do on engineering management than murder boards, right? So you probably should just think of finding a new job. So it should not be part of a regular development life cycle because fear should not be part of your regular development life cycle. When they're done well, they build a lot of trust, they build a lot of confidence. They're not toxic or aggressive things. They're about teams supporting one another. But they do require you to be grounded in that existential threat before they can do that. So thank you very much, guys. It's been a great fun to talk to you today. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions before lunch. So I'm happy to take any questions you have.
All right, all right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you.
So just in case, Slido, and the hashtag is up there. Let's check here.
Also, 5 stars. Give me 5 stars.
No, we didn't have questions. Just loading up here. All right, perfect. So we have a question. Can you recommend ways to prepare teams to go through this process? You kind of hinted at the end around trust.
Yeah. So the best way to prepare a team to go through this process is to have them essentially kind of spec out what they think could go wrong. So like a threat model in security, right? Like, what is the absolute worst thing that could happen? And now going backwards through our architecture, how would that worst thing happen? Like, what would have to fail in order for that to happen? This is just a generally good technique preparing people for triage on call and operations overall. Like, I spent a lot of time doing process maps with people, making them go forward and backwards across a transaction, sort of like do these scenarios, because it's the same sort of deductive reasoning you use in triage, and it's excellent for something like this.
Got it. Good. Thank you for the answer. Next question. Any example of a murder board going wrong?
Yeah, well, so when murder boards go wrong, it's usually because people don't respect the social aspect of it. It's about trust and respect and like supporting your colleagues. And they go, great, this is a time to be an asshole, so I'm just gonna go be an asshole, right? So like that's usually when it goes wrong. And I spent a lot of time with the murder board, like prepping them for this, right? That like this isn't about attacking people, it's about attacking plans. So let's focus on the plan.
So you can have people like sharpening knives and like pitchforks. Okay, all right.
No.
Next up, trying to judge the application situations for murder board. How often do such high risk, high fear situations appear for you? And how often are you doing this?
Very rarely. Very rarely. I would say like I've done maybe 2 or 3 in the last 10 years, right? It's to not be part of your regular process. But it's a neat tool to sort of have in your back pocket, because we do encounter these scenarios where people are just facing these sort of crippling fears and anxieties about stuff they have to do. There's no choice. Like, we did not have a choice with upgrading the runtimes. We could shut the entire feature down, or we could upgrade the runtimes. That was the extent of our options here. So we had to figure out a way to get them through it. And so you will encounter situations in your career where there is something that's just cripplingly fear-inducing for people, but it has to be done.
Are there patterns that come up for you that you look for this?
I spend a lot of time doing one-on-ones with people and talking to people. And when I do one-on-ones with people, I don't, some people come into a one-on-one and they're like, give me a status check on what you're doing. And I'm more like, how are you doing on one-on-ones? So when I see a group of engineers that are terrified of doing a thing, that is usually where it starts to come up in one-on-ones, where you're talking to them, you're sort of seeing their anxiety and they're avoiding the situation, right? And so that's sort of how I keep the litmus test.
Yeah, I can imagine like the lack of decision can be also kind of one of those triggers, because nobody wants to make a decision on that because of that fear.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. The big thing is like, how many times have we pushed back doing it, right? If you've seen something where we pushed back the upgrade like 5 times, like that's a good hint that people are scared of doing it.
Definitely. Given the negative connotation of the murder board, how do you pitch this idea to the team?
I did write a book called Kill with Fire, so I think most people are used to this idea that I have some of the exaggerated language inclination. But, I'm not a huge fan of using euphemisms for established terms. And so as much as I may want to I think that murder board is a very extreme and aggressive terminology. That is what it's called, right? So they can Google it and read the research on it and read the history on it. If I give it a nicer, politer name, I'm cutting them off from the entire history of that, right? So that's sort of how I justify it to myself. It is literally what it's called.
Got it, thank you. Is there a maximum or minimum murder board size?
Oh, this is a good
Is there
question.
optimal size in that?
That's a good question. I like to keep it around 5, maybe 4 to 6 people. I think it depends on the size of the group defending, right? If it's like one person defending, which is usually the scenario in like congressional testimony, we would really only have like 4 people on the murder board. Like, you don't want to overwhelm people. It's like one person in like 20 people yelling questions at them that's too aggressive, right? But if we have a team, an engineering team of people, I might go more on the closer to 5 to 6 people side of it.
Got it. And then maybe one last question. Aren't straw man and other fallacies a thing to prepare for? I can easily imagine jerk questions this way.
Yeah, I mean, if you're testifying in front of Congress, these sort of things absolutely come up. Absolutely. When you're preparing for a deploy or an upgrade, usually servers don't ask you straw man questions. So again, it depends what you're preparing for. It might be relevant in the moment, it might not.
Well, thank you again. A round of applause again for Marianne. And here's a little keepsake from